friendly. Yeah, and my wife. Oh. Something to remember. And a story. Plus, if you were not ready.
It was good. It was really cool. Yeah, it's hot. We didn't have an agenda. Next week we're doing that. From now on, it's on my list. Oh yes. It's on Mondays and we're doing I saw enough friendly faces.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MIT SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel, Director of the Security Studies Program. And today I'm really excited to welcome Dani Gilbert to MIT. She's going to speak on a new paper, No Man Left Behind, Hostage Deservingness and the Politics of Hostage Recovery. Dani is the David and Cindy Edelson Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy and International Security at the Joan Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. So there's a lot of branding that is going on right there. I'm glad I got it right. So in fall 2000, this coming fall, she's going to join Northwestern University as an assistant professor of political science. Her research explores the causes and consequences of hostage taking in international security, including projects on rebel kidnapping, hostage recovery policy, and hostage diplomacy. Her current book project examines why and how armed groups kidnapped during Civil War. It is based on her doctoral dissertation, which received the Mers Tate Award in 2001 from the American Political Science Association for the best dissertation in international relations, law, and politics. Her research has been supported by a variety of institutions, including the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the United States Institute of Peace, and the Minerva Research Initiative, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and the Cosmos Club Foundation. Well, that sounds like probably a lot of fun. Her writing's been published in the American Political Science Review, the Texas National Security Review, Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, the Journal of Political Science Education, and in policy outlets like Foreign Affairs, Lawfare, War on the Rocks, and the Washington Post. Before entering academia, she served for 4 years on Capitol Hill and worked as a policy advisor on presidential and congressional campaigns. Finally, she received her her PhD in political science from George Washington University, a master's degree from George Washington as well, and the London School of Economics, and a BA in ethics, politics, and economics from Yale. So, Dani, welcome to MIT.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here today to present No Man Left Behind, Hostage Deservingness and the Politics of Hostage Recovery, which is co-authored with Lauren Prather from UCSD. So for a lot of 2022, last year, I was thinking all the time about Brittany Griner and her ordeal that she experienced in Russia. I had published previously on the phenomenon of hostage diplomacy, which is when states use their criminal justice system to take foreigners hostage. And Brittany Griner's ordeal became a major issue in the United States, a major issue for the media, for the public, in foreign policy, that people really cared about getting Brittany Griner, this WNBA star who had been arrested in Russia. They cared about her ordeal, and they seemed to care about wanting her to come home. Politicians talked a lot about the pressure that they were feeling. The press really talked about the public advocacy and the attention to Brittany Griner's case, with celebrities coming out, the WNBA advocating, Al Sharpton, et cetera. And so this is kind of the traditional story that we hear about hostages and wrongful detainees, that the public cares, that the public really wants to make sure that people come home. And at the end of the day, when an administration needs to make the difficult choices about what they might have to give up to bring home an American who's held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad, that those considerations are really about the difficulty in making concessions to an adversary. And this goes along with what the nascent scholarship on hostage recovery says. Essentially, that hostage takers are more likely to target democracies. That is empirically the case, that democratic countries experience more hostage-taking targeting than non-democratic states. And that the reason hostage takers target democracies is because the public cares about hostages and they pressure policymakers to respond. So it's a story about policymakers responding, which makes them a better target for the hostage takers. But there's another story to the Brittany Griner ordeal, which some of you may have seen in coverage, and I certainly was experiencing all the time, which is that not everybody was thrilled about her coming home. Not everybody was thrilled about the US government making concessions, and plenty of people thought that she, in some sense, got what she deserved. This is a quote, Ms. Gilbert, that's me. The New York Times doesn't use doctors for non-medical doctors, that I had been getting just a torrent of hate mail from people saying that Brittany Griner should have stayed in Russia, that she got what she deserved, and that the US government should not have done anything to bring her back. So this is a side of the hostage-taking drama that we don't often talk about and that is kind of surprising for a couple of reasons. So this leads me to the questions that are in the paper that I'm going to be talking about today. First of all, does the public care about hostage-taking and recovery? The scholarship says, as I mentioned before, that hostage takers intentionally target democracies because the public cares and pressures policymakers to respond. Conventional wisdom says that the public really doesn't care about foreign policy at all. So we might be surprised that the public would know about this, would care about this, or would pressure governments to respond. And if there is public attention, does that pressure affect the hostage recovery process? Why does it matter what the public might think about hostage taking and hostage recovery? Conventional wisdom is that leaders fear the consequences of failing to recover hostages. So is that true? My argument in brief that I'll be talking about today is that public pressure, while typically high, is conditional on two factors: on the public's perception of the hostage and of the costs of bringing the hostage home. The public relies on what Lauren and I describe as the deservingness heuristic. It's based in evolutionary psychology that identifies people as worthy of help if they're victims of circumstance, i.e., if someone is not to blame, if someone didn't put themselves in harm's way. But the opposite is also true, that if the public sees someone as responsible for putting themselves in danger, the public is less supportive of government efforts to help them. So high support for hostage recovery, which is typically rather high, plummets when the hostage is framed as being responsible, bless you, responsible for being in a dangerous situation, especially for costly recovery options. So I'll unpack that over the talk today. So I'm going to take you back to where some of the conventional wisdom of hostage dramas and hostage recovery comes from, which is the case of the 1979 Iran hostage crisis. Probably those of you in the room are familiar with this, that the US Embassy in Tehran was taken hostage in 1979. 52 American hostages were held for 444 days. It was an enormous political drama. It was the start of nightly cable disaster news coverage. People were paying very much attention to this. And the Carter presidency really suffered for its inability to recover these hostages and bring them home. They tried negotiations, which continued to fail. They launched a completely ill-advised and totally unsuccessful rescue attempt that did not bring any of the hostages back. And the conventional wisdom is that this was key to Jimmy Carter losing the 1980 presidential election, that he, in fact, didn't have a second term as president because of the hostage crisis. And just a couple of months ago, there was new reporting about this case in the New York Times that essentially some of the Reagan-allied operatives went over to the Middle East to make sure that the hostages were not released until after Carter was out of the White House. And I want to highlight just a couple of quotes from this article that illustrate the logic. Carter didn't have a fighting chance with those hostages still in the embassy in Iran. Just this real assumption that this was crucial to tanking his reelection. On the flip side, if we had gotten the hostages home, we'd have won. So really imagining that the outcome of the election was all about this hostage crisis. So sometimes when the government is able to rescue or recover a hostage, it's a great victory. And so you can see the positive feedback when the government does what the public might want in a hostage recovery effort. So this is an image from the rescue of Captain Richard Phillips, was a merchant marine whose ship was hijacked by Somali pirates. And the Navy SEALs launched a daring rescue mission. They were able to rescue Captain Phillips. Everyone was happy. There's a movie with Tom Hanks playing Captain Phillips. I can't imagine a more celebratory response than having Tom Hanks play you in a film. And here everything worked out, right? Captain Phillips, the kind of hostage that people were excited about recovering. But it doesn't always work like that. So some of you in the room might recall the story of Bo Bergdahl, an American soldier who walked off his base in 2009 and was almost immediately captured by the Haqqani network, held by the Taliban for 5 years. The military launched numerous special operations attempts to recover Bergdahl, all of which failed and came with casualties for the US military. And ultimately, 5 years later, President Obama exchanged, to bring Bo Bergdahl home, 5 senior Taliban officials who had been held at Guantanamo. So in the announcement of Bergdahl coming home, President Obama in the Rose Garden emphasized the logic of no man left behind, right? Of the United States will come for you when this happens to you. The United States of America does not ever leave our men and women in uniform behind. But there was a lot of controversy around this case, and it came out just in the days after President Obama made this announcement that there was significant public blowback because people were not excited about Bo Bergdahl coming home. There was polling that said that President Obama had handled this terribly, and lots of figures, including former President Trump, who really played up on this in the lead up to running for president, calling Bo Bergdahl a traitor and all of the ways that he had been a disgrace to the military. So the juxtaposition of Captain Phillips and Bo Bergdahl really raises the question for us about what the public thinks about hostages. So I'm going to tell you about our argument and logic for why the public cares about hostage recovery and why it might affect foreign policy outcomes. So typically we assume that the public actually doesn't care much or pay attention or know a lot about foreign policy at all. But there's a few specific reasons to believe that the American public at least cares a lot about hostage taking and hostage recovery as one type of foreign policy that they are paying attention to. The first is from literature that suggests that kidnappings and hostage takings are highly salient, newsworthy events. They draw significantly more media coverage than a lot of other forms of violence. Second, kidnappings and hostage takings are the kind of foreign policy event that make their way into soft news. You don't have to be watching really hard-hitting political commentary or substantive commentary to know, to have it kind of sneak into magazines that you might buy in the grocery store checkout line when there is a hostage taking. And so that coverage is more widespread compared to other types of foreign policy news coverage. Third is this element of the collapse of compassion, or the identified victim effect, which essentially says that people have a really hard time paying attention to numerous victims of violence, but it's really easy to pay attention to one single person with a name and a face and a story. And hostages are just that kind of case, that you're thinking about one person and not more widespread violence, which drives attention and sympathy. The existing literature about hostage taking targeting really suggests that all of these factors kind of come together for the reason that hostage takers target democracies in the first place. That because of a commitment to human rights, to civil liberties, and because of press freedom that will be likely to report on these events, that the public pressures policymakers to do something in these particular cases. Last but not least, even if the conventional wisdom might be that policymaking preferences come and foreign policy preferences come from the elite to the public, recent research by Tom Weeks and Yari Milo suggests that policymakers actually do care and respond to what the public thinks through two mechanisms: responsiveness and selection. Responsiveness is acting in a way to respond to public preferences, and selection in that how policymakers behave in a foreign policy crisis could shape future electoral outcomes. So with all of this, understanding why hostage taking might be relevant in the news and might shape policymaker preferences, we introduced this notion of the deservingness heuristic as applied to hostage taking. So there's been a ton of research in studies of welfare policies, for example, and poverty about this notion of deservingness, which states that judgments about how individuals came to need assistance in the first place affect how the public views the obligations of the governments to help. In short, if the public believes that poor people are unlucky, then those people are likely to support efforts of the government to help that person out. If that same public believes that people are poor because they are lazy or because they made mistakes of their own volition, then those people are less likely to support efforts to help that population. So that question about responsibility versus luck comes out and has been shown in lots of other policy areas. We believe that we can apply the same deservingness heuristic to the question of hostage recovery. Just like welfare policies, hostage recovery is a choice of a government to allocate valuable resources, in some cases significant resources, to help individuals who are in need of assistance. And so we can expect that the public might ask itself in these situations, did the hostage use bad judgment, or did they end up in this situation just out of bad luck? We have three hypotheses in this paper. First, the more that individuals are perceived as responsible for their capture, the less the public will support efforts to bring them home. Second, the public will have higher support for less costly recovery options, such as small rescue missions or smaller ransom payments versus larger rescue missions and larger ransom payments. This is the blood and treasure argument. And third, we believe that there's going to be an interaction between these two effects, that the public is most cost sensitive when hostages are perceived as being responsible for their capture. We test our hypotheses using three different methodological approaches. We have a vignette-style survey experiment, a Facebook ad experiment that just ran last month, and a series of elite interviews, which just wrapped up about a week ago. So I will walk through these three methods and their results. So first, we ran a vignette-style survey experiment several years ago. So this was way back in 2020, back when hostage-taking was much more the purview of non-state actors, unlike state hostage-taking, which has really been on the rise in the past couple of years. We used the Dynata online survey platform. It's a nationally representative survey of 2,000 respondents, following up to an initial survey that Lauren had run actually all the way back in 2016. So here is the beginning of the vignette in our survey experiment, where we vary lots of different features of the hostage taking. And so here you see that some armed group, whether rebel or terrorist, captured an American of varying professions in a varying list of countries, and that they are believed to be held in the armed group stronghold. We also varied the gender of the hostage. Then we have a cue about whether or not that person, essentially how responsible they were for getting themselves into the place where they were eventually captured. For the non-hiker professions, the soldier, the aid worker, and the journalist, we basically say that the person was either following orders, didn't have the knowledge, or went against the orders of their superior. We change that a little bit for the hiker because there's not really a superior that we would think of. We talk about whether or not they're listening to the travel warnings from the US State Department. All right. So now I'm going to show you some of the results from the survey. Overwhelmingly, the United States, our respondents from the American public are supportive of efforts to bring hostages home. They are most supportive of rescue missions. Strong majority of the US population either approves somewhat or approves strongly efforts to rescue American hostages. They are the least supportive of different options of ransom payments, with more than a quarter of the population opposing strongly the payment of ransoms, which we think might be part of the we don't make concessions to terrorists or things like that, kind of a no concessions logic. So you can see across rescuing, negotiating, and paying, some variety, but with lots of support for bringing captives home. We ask our respondents whether or not the hostage is to blame for their circumstances of capture. And now this pools across all of the different treatment groups that you can see. A plurality of respondents believe that the hostage is somewhat to blame, with about a little over 20% thinking the person is completely to blame, and fewer thinking that they are completely or somewhat blameless. But that's pulling across all the different treatments. So once we separate it, this is kind of our check on the mechanism of deservingness, that we test essentially the respondents' perceptions of deservingness by the blame treatment. So you can see that for those that went against or without orders or permission of the State Department, much less willingness to recover. So we can see that our mechanism is working there. Okay, I'll walk through the results of the three different hypotheses. So our first hypothesis, if you recall, is that the perceptions of deservingness will affect the public's support for recovery. So at the vertical line for both of these is for those who are following orders. So that's kind of the reference group. And you can see that there's significantly less support for recovering hostages, either to rescue them or to pay ransom if they went against or without the support of their supervisor. Second, we test the cost mechanism. How much are Americans affected by the blood and treasure required to recover a hostage? So this is the number of soldiers that we said would be required for a hostage mission: 10, 100, or 1,000. In some ways, any three of these numbers might be correct, depending on who you count as actually part of the mission, right? There might be 10 people on the ground, 100 in country, and 1,000 people working on it total. But those were the three different numbers that we used. And you can see statistically significant less approval for rescue when it requires 1,000 lives on the line. We see similar results when we talk about the amount for a ransom payment, whether it's to negotiate for that ransom demand or to actually pay for that ransom demand. The three amounts that we have here are $100,000, $1 million, and $10 million. And that there is a statistically significant reduced support from the $100,000 demand once you get to $1 million or $10 million. So this is the part that is really the clutch, the centerpiece of the argument, which is that these two factors interact with each other. That you can see that for the top line, which is the hostages that are considered deserving, and the bottom line, which is those hostages considered undeserving, that there is a significant difference in approval as ransom amount increases. And we see the largest difference here, which is where it's statistically significant difference in approval for supporting the ransom payment at $1 million, which for external validity is actually the closest to real world amount typically of a ransom payment. Second, we look at this in terms of the number of soldiers required for a recovery mission. So not really a significant difference between hostages considered deserving and not deserving when we're operating with 10 soldiers. But as soon as you get to 100 and 1,000, a significant difference between willingness to support a rescue mission for a hostage considered deserving or undeserving. So in addition to our survey experiment, we wanted to test this in the real world, essentially have a behavioral test of our survey experiment. And so just last month, we ran a Facebook ad experiment using Meta's A/B testing capabilities, essentially to see in the real world, without knowing that they're taking a survey, how people respond to these similar sorts of cues about cost and perceptions of deservingness for hostages. Facebook Meta ad testing allows you to have 5 different versions of an ad. So we have 1 control and 4 treatments that I will show you right now. So this is our control. It says, American soldiers are sometimes taken hostage in dangerous countries. The US government can authorize the military to conduct rescue missions. So we know here that people are taken hostage and that the military can do something about it, but there's no explicit mention of cost or deservingness. In our 4 treatments, we essentially vary a high and low cost and a high and low deservingness across our 4 different treatments. So sometimes we say soldiers get sent to dangerous countries and are taken hostage, versus American soldiers sometimes walk away from their posts. And by sometimes we mean Bo Bergdahl, but that's the undeserving, the way we primed the undeserving treatment. And we have rescue missions can put hundreds of military lives at risk versus dozens of military lives at risk. So that's how we are proxying cost. So in some ways, the Facebook ad experiment is illustrating the mechanisms from the survey. In some ways, not at all. So I'm going to walk through that. The first thing that you will see is that if you do an ad experiment on Facebook, you will get a lot of data. So it was seen hundreds of thousands of times our ads across them. There is no statistically significant difference in clicks on the ad across the 5 treatments. There seems that there is some variation, and actually it is the one that we would expect to be most controversial that got the most clicks. Hundreds of lives at risk for the soldiers that have walked away from their bases. However, we do see significant differences in the likes and in a qualitative sense, the content of the comments. So I will talk about those right now. So when we look at the likes on the different ads, you can see very different in terms of the numbers of likes that we get on these ads based on the treatment. The control got the most likes, that had no statement of cost, no mention of what the US would have to give up to try to rescue, or soldiers' lives put at risk to have to rescue a hostage. But then across the different treatments, essentially there is this interaction of the cost and the deservingness heuristic, where the dozens of lives at risk for a deserving hostage get significantly more likes than the hostages who are seen as not deserving. And I'll just share some of the comments that we got on these different ads. So this is for the control, and the comment is, go in hot, take out what's in your way, and get our people. Kind of this rah, go recover American hostages. It needs to be done. Always get our soldiers home. But when we start introducing this deservingness heuristic, you have people who are quite angry. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. A lot of people talking about that's called treason, that's not a hostage, it's your own fault if you walk away from your post. And this is maybe the most dramatic example that we can think of, but these dynamics also emerge when you think about lots of different hostages. Why were they in the place that they went to? That comes out pretty clearly across our comments. We also, in some of the other treatments, got a lot of comparisons to Brittany Griner, who is still very clearly on people's minds for these dynamics. Last, but certainly not least, are the elite interviews that we conducted to support this project, and specifically to answer the question, why does it matter what the public thinks if policymakers aren't responding to it? So between January and April, I conducted 19 interviews, some in person, some over the phone, some over Zoom, with current and former relevant elite officials in the hostage recovery enterprise. So these are principals and senior staff in the 3 executive branch offices that deal with hostage recovery and hostage policy, which is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, otherwise known as the SPIHA, the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which is an interagency body at the FBI, tasked with the operational level decisions for bringing home a hostage, and the Hostage Response Group, which are the officials at the National Security Council who make those decisions about what to do for hostages. I've also interviewed a handful of senior DoD officials who partook in some hostage recovery efforts, and senior staff from the Senate who have written hostage recovery policy in recent years. So across these interviews, there are a few mechanisms that we illustrate to provide support for our argument. And specifically, it's 4 factors. First, that policymakers too, and not just the public, are susceptible to notions of deservingness. Second, that policymakers debated notions of deservingness, especially as it related to cost. Third, that they fear blowback from recovering unsympathetic or undeserving hostages. And fourth, that they intentionally shape the messaging to avoid public judgment. And all of this comes we focus on this because the official stated US government policy is that the circumstances of capture don't matter, that it doesn't matter why you got taken, the government will come to recover you. So I draw on a few exemplary quotes to illustrate some of these dynamics. So I was talking to one of the policymakers, and they were lamenting both the story of Sam Goodwin and the story of Otto Warmbier. Sam Goodwin was detained in Syria in 2019 as he was traveling around trying to visit every country in the world. Otto Warmbier, pictured on this slide, went on a trip to North Korea, was caught stealing a propaganda poster, was detained in North Korea, and died as a result of his captivity. So, you know, you can see this quote on the screen. It's almost surprising how forthcoming the policymakers were. Of course, we do what we do to help, but in my head, you're like, what the hell were you doing in Syria? You were trying to visit every country in the world? How stupid. There's an element of frustration. You had no business going there. How many warnings does the US government have to give not to travel to North Korea? People do this black market tourism, and the families are like, help us. But in the back of your mind, you're like, what the hell? What were you doing going there? So you say it in private, you say it behind closed doors. This person had no business going there. Second, I want to talk about the case of Caitlin Coleman and Joshua Boyle. So some of you might be familiar with this case. Caitlin is an American citizen. Her husband, Josh, was a Canadian citizen. And they are kind of the quintessential who goes hiking in Afghanistan story. They were hiking in Afghanistan. She was pregnant. They were captured by the Taliban, held for years, and had multiple children in captivity. And so policymakers talked a lot about the internal debates about recovering Caitlin Coleman. So one said to me, I think if she'd been by herself, or if her husband didn't have a history of very strange things, I think it would have had a different outcome. Here would be a woman with a small child, you know, let's get her out faster. We need to work harder. I think we did work pretty hard, but I know in some instances, having him there became a problem. And so you see this coming out as an internal debate between the different agencies and offices who are tasked with hostage recovery. One of the policymakers said, DOD, the Department of Defense, is now livid, and they would throw that in our face. Like, why are we wasting our resources here? Why are we spending high-value assets to go after somebody that got themselves in a predicament they shouldn't have, right? So this quote, I think, distills the interaction between the deservingness, circumstances of capture, and the cost. And just to bring this back to the Brittany Griner case, we think a lot about the internal debate over the operational costs or maybe the legal costs of releasing Victor Boot in her exchange. But people draw on this when they're making their internal debates about why should we give up something valuable for someone who did this to themselves. So here we have the conventional wisdom that comes out in the interviews that the Iran hostage crisis took down a presidency. Nobody ever wanted to be caught out again like Jimmy Carter, right? That's our conventional wisdom. But on the other hand, we really have the opposite. Nobody also wants to be on the front lines advocating for someone like Bo Bergdahl, a deserter who caused political suffering and the death of his squad mates and people trying to rescue him. They're particularly cognizant of this dynamic as it intersects deservingness and cost. So if we go in there and SEALs get killed and we've got to face the American public over somebody who did something stupid, I'm sure that had to weigh in the back of people's minds. So policymakers take what they know about this and they intentionally try to shape the messaging to talk to the public about hostages, to reduce the public's willingness to judge them. They're shaping that message to reduce their own blowback. So as one policymaker said to me, we advise families to build a sympathetic narrative. They're not an unnecessary risk taker. They were somehow just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And not only do policymakers advise families of that, they also talk about it consciously and quite publicly. So one policymaker said, we decided pretty early on we're going to make it very clear and build it into speeches and talking points that Americans are adventurous, that hikers, journalists, the ex-military, they're contributing to the fabric of life. So we consciously tried to build that narrative that you see now with leaders repeating our words, that the only thing that matters is the color of your passport. So across these three empirical tests, there's a few things that we believe our work has shown. First, that US public support for hostage recovery is conditional on cost in terms of blood and treasure and perceptions of hostage deservingness. Second, that some of those effects hold in our behavioral social media test, that we get the most attention to the most controversial set of treatments, but at the same time, the most likes for the most deserving and least costly recovery efforts. And last but not least, that policymakers are susceptible to notions of deservingness, that they debate deservingness and cost internally, that they fear public blowback from unpopular recoveries, and they shape their messaging accordingly. A few contributions that we believe come out of this work. It's a first exploration to the best of our knowledge of public opinion of hostage recovery, which is something that we think is very important that has not received scholarly attention yet. And we address that through public opinion, a behavioral test, and elite interviews. We believe it's an explanation for unexpected hostage controversies. If we expect the public to always want hostages home, what explains this anger for certain cases? And a real-world demonstration of policymaker responsiveness. We see in real time that policymakers are responding to what the public thinks about in these particular cases. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
The live stream portion. And wow, there are a lot of hands up. This is